Hello and welcome to this episode of the GrowVC Everyone Funding Startups podcast. I'm your host Marcus, and today I'm here with Helen Keegan, who knows the ins and outs of the mobile space and among many other things is currently running accessibility workshops in several locations. We'll get into all of that in a second, but first of all, Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks very much. Good to be here.
So let's get a little bit of an introduction to you first. What's your background like and where have you come from?
Well, originally I worked in fashion retail, and that, by a circuitous route, led me to mobile back in 2000. And I've been consulting now in mobile marketing, advertising and media for the last 10 years or so. I mainly work with large media owners, that's TV companies, newspapers and magazines, both in the UK and in the Nordic region. And I also work with some handset manufacturers, network operators and other organisations on developer outreach work, which is obviously a growing area. And for fun, I organised the now 10-year-old Swedish Beers networking party in London and Barcelona.
Okay, and you're currently working on a few upcoming accessibility workshops. I believe you held one yesterday as well. So could you elaborate on those a little bit, what they are and basically who they cater for and so on?
Sure. Well, the idea behind these workshops were to help mainstream developers understand the issues and challenges faced by people with any kind of impairment or disability. And we've actually forgotten that some of the best innovations come out of adversity, if you like. A prime example of this is the cordless kettle. That was actually designed for disabled people who couldn't plug the cord back into the back of a kettle. We can't imagine life in our kitchens now. Certainly I can't imagine life in my kitchen without the cordless kettle. So these workshops are designed to help developers, entrepreneurs and designers get their heads around the market for impairment and disabled people. We think it's a small niche market, but actually it's pretty huge. 11 million adults in the UK have some kind of disability, and that's a registered disability. And this doesn't include those with a temporary impairment, perhaps recovering from a serious illness, or you've had something like a stroke or some other very disabling illness. Or they're carers as well. So the other market we're looking at is those who look after disabled people who also need access to some of these tools so that they can help the elderly and the disabled people in their lives. So the reason for me getting involved in this was through my work with Vodafone. I've been working on the Vodafone Mobile Clicks competition for the last 3 years. And this is a new award now from Vodafone Foundation called the Smart Accessibility Awards. There's a €200,000 prize fund, and the competition will award the best Android smartphone application in 4 key areas. These are social participation, independent living, mobility, and well-being. The closing date for the awards is the 15th of October, so it's not long to go now. And the idea behind the workshops was to support entrepreneurs to get their heads around this area. So rather than just doing blanket advertising that the awards and the competition was on, we wanted to do something useful for the developer community to help them enter the awards in the first place. So that's how it came around. We've already done 3 workshops. So we've done one in Edinburgh, and yesterday we did workshops in Belfast and London. And there's one coming up next Wednesday in Manchester.
Okay, in terms of these workshops, let's, for example, look at the one yesterday. What did you do in that workshop and how did it go in general?
Well, it was a mix of case studies and presentations, and some very personal stories came out. So obviously we looked at the business case for accessibility, and that's how I've got the figures about 11 million adults. And I also know that hearing is one of the major disabilities. Didn't know that before. And so we looked at the business case. We looked, I suppose, at the moral case. We saw some videos of disabled people talking about their experiences with their mobile phones, and learned about a testing centre called the Digital Accessibility Centre, who help brands and agencies and developers to work with disabled people to find out how they use this stuff and to test their apps. And we heard some very personal stories from a friend of mine called Maurizio Reyes, who suffered a stroke earlier this year. And I actually visited him in hospital, and he's a developer himself. He works in the software industry. So he actually used technology as part of his rehab, and it was a very important part of his rehab. So his story was really interesting. And we also heard the Freedom Phone story, which is from the Rebo design company, where they worked together with ICT KTN, who's one of the big supporters of the workshops alongside Vodafone, to do a report about accessibility in mobile devices. And out of that came the idea that actually all we need is a 3-button phone. We can really simplify the Android experience to just 3 buttons and still give a rich experience to the end customer. So you can still have photos, you can still call everybody, you can still do all your messaging, and you can still have access to apps. So it's really exciting to see things like that. We were also most inspired by Jonathan Hassel, who shared some really great stories about how working with disabled people in mind has brought out some really major innovations. And so hopefully the audience will have gone away inspired. As a follow-up, we'll be sharing most of the slides on the Mobile Monday London blog and the Vodafone developer blog. And hopefully there'll be a few video clips as well.
No, that's great. And that's something that we'll link also in the footnotes of this episode. But one of the things that we hear from investors, particularly something that we've heard as a rising trend recently, is that investors also look for cases where they can do good while doing well. So something that actually has an impact. So I guess it also plays into this notion that by solving a real pain, a real problem that people face, you actually also solve, or you actually improve the condition of many people's day-to-day life. It's kind of like a bigger market than we normally think of. So I guess from that point of view, it's also a lucrative market for many people to consider that they might not consider ahead of time. Is that something that was also supported by the cases that we went through yesterday? And is that the case, or is that something that people recognize, do you think?
Yes, I do think they recognise this. And certainly having worked in this area, I mean, I've never worked in this area before, so this has been a massive learning curve for me. And I do feel we have some kind of moral duty to look at this area, because there are some very simple things like making font sizes a bit easier and not using italics so much so that dyslexic people can read text easily. There are some really quick wins just to make life a bit easier for a lot more people. But at the same time, you look at the cordless kettle and how that has revolutionised our tea making, certainly in the UK. I don't know about anywhere else, but certainly in the UK. Now, what about the equivalent of that in the mobile world? It might be Freedom, or it might be something like Cereproc, which I saw in the Edinburgh workshop about 10 days ago, where they've got voice. So they're transforming kind of read text to you. So they can convert written text into voice, but it's not any old voice. It's not the robotic voice. It's not the really difficult to concentrate voice that you hear on current readers that are for blind people for the internet. It's using your own voice, or a voice of your choice with real expression and intonation. Okay, it's still a synthetic voice, but it's a whole lot better than the existing stuff out there. Now that's really exciting as well. So in terms of innovation, I think being constrained actually creates more opportunity. And in thinking about a disabled person in mind who has some kind of constraint, I think we'll see a lot more innovation.
It's something that, I mean, every once in a while you come across very innovative solutions to, or very simple solutions to problems that people don't consider. Like, for example, one case that I heard recently was GPS shoes. I mean, you have GPS in shoes that vibrate based on where you're going because you can't see the phone or something like that. It seems silly simple in a way. So in terms of these innovations, you mentioned that you had a massive learning curve to this industry or this segment. What do you look forward to in terms of things to come out of this, these workshops, this program in general?
Yeah, well, one thing I really found was that accessibility is still a niche. It seems to be in a silo. And that's just not right. This stuff needs to be mainstream. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First off, accessibility goes both ways. So organisations and charities who work with disabled people sometimes have a bit of a political agenda and don't necessarily make it easy for people like me who have no experience of this area to get their heads around it. Now, I had lots of questions with various organisations I spoke to, and most of them were really, really nice and really supportive. But there were a few who just